Hi, and welcome to the Good Health Podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Good, a registered nutritional therapy practitioner and functional medicine practitioner. Join me as we explore thyroid, brain, and fatigue conditions with positivity. From Hashimoto's to multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue to adrenal dysfunction, I've got you covered. With expert advice and tips to help you take action now and inspiring real patient stories from successful individuals who refuse to let their health hold them back. Start your journey to good health today. And don't forget to come and join the conversation on Instagram at good_health. That's GOODE. Or visit my website at nicolegoodhealth.com to find out more. Okay, so on today's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. I have given the people on my email list the opportunity to send in their questions. So we're going to be going through some of the answers on here today. And the reason really for doing this is so that you guys get the answers to the questions that you've got. Because I know a lot of you listening, you listen to episodes and you send questions in. So I thought, why not give you the opportunity to do this and we'll actually answer them on the podcast. So a little bit different today, but we're going to jump into the questions that you guys have been sending in. Okay, so question 1 is from Jane. Why do you think autoimmune disease is affecting people now more than before? Okay, so I guess sort of two sides to this. So the first part is post-COVID. We're seeing a lot more immune diseases that potentially would have triggered in people anyway, or they have the genetics for it, but COVID has acted as a trigger. So we know that viruses can be a trigger for autoimmune diseases. It's one of the big, it's one of the big sort of triggers for autoimmunity. So COVID is no different. It can act as that sort of viral trigger to activate the autoimmunity. Obviously, all the other factors have got to be there. So you've got to have the right environment, you've got to have the genetics, you've got to have the trigger. And then in some people, COVID is acting as the trigger. So we are seeing an increase in autoimmunity post-COVID. Part of this, as well as being the actual COVID being the trigger itself, a viral trigger, is we're seeing people with impaired immune function, partly because of having had COVID. In other respects, people who have had vaccination, so their immune system has had it's another knock to the immune system. And also just being locked down because we've not, we had that period where nobody was mixing, nobody was really seeing other people. And, it's when we mix that we pick things up and our immune system activates and actions and starts, fighting these viruses off. And because we weren't doing that, we actually had sort of lowered immune function from all of that. So from COVID infection, from COVID vaccines, and from the lockdowns and not sort of seeing people. So there's that impaired immune function as well. So there's the fact that the actual COVID could be acting as a viral trigger itself. Also the fact that over this period, we're seeing a lot of people with this impaired immunity. Off the back of that impaired immunity, we're also seeing a lot of growth of things like mold. So other bacteria being able to take hold in the gut, if the gut's maybe not quite as healthy as it was, if there's impaired immune function within the gut, we're seeing some more sort of bacterial overgrowth and things like that can act as triggers. We're seeing more mold, maybe because people's lungs potentially have been impacted, respiratory has been impacted from COVID. And we're seeing, or just that their immune function is impaired and we're not able to get rid of the mold as we would. We're not keeping it out, basically. Our, immune function isn't as good. So that's another sort of thing that can come from the sort of the post-COVID. And the third thing that we're really sort of seeing post-COVID is reactivated viruses. So we're seeing a lot of viruses, particularly things like the ones that live in your body anyway. So if you've ever had Epstein-Barr virus, it lives in your body. So you're always going to have it, but it's a low viral load and it doesn't really impact you. We're seeing reactivation of these viruses. So things like cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus, HHV6, we are getting reactivations of those, and we're finding this on testing quite a lot that this is actually happening. And again, we're seeing that sort of post-COVID. So that's the sort of growth that we're seeing specifically from this sort of post-COVID era. With that, we're seeing a lot of joint, a lot of neurological, and a lot of skin. So they seem to be ones that we're seeing a lot in clinic following either infection or vaccination or just that sort of lockdown period. Outside of COVID, if we look outside of this sort of pre and post pandemic, which I think we do tend to look at things a bit that way these days, don't we? It's either sort of happened pre or post that time. But even if we go back before that, autoimmune diseases are growing anyway. So it is something that was happening prior to COVID. We've just seen this sort of bigger boost through COVID, but it was happening anyway. So the prevalence was growing. And I think a lot of this comes, and I actually I'm talking about this in my book that's coming out this year. I do talk about this in that. There's a lot to do with our lifestyles, basically the life that we're living, and stress. Stress is a huge trigger for autoimmunity. And we can't get away from the fact that we live a much more stressful life now than we used to. And, we live fast-paced lifestyles. We're all working. We're working longer hours. We don't even, we finish work if you take our grandparents, they would have finished work at, 5:30, gone home, and they were home. They were out of work. We don't really have that luxury anymore. We all have computers. We all have laptops. We all have phones. We all got emails. We don't really get away from work. So we go home from work, maybe, if you're lucky, you go home from work at 5:30. But you're not really going home. I'm sure that, emails are pinging in, and there's always work that you can actually do because you've got your laptop there. And, so we don't shut off the same way that even just our grandparents. It's not really, you don't really have to go that far back to see a difference. And, that's an added stress because we're not giving ourselves that downtime. We also have, of course, there's things like people are living longer. So that mid-generation, middle age is that common age to sort of get autoimmunity. We're having children later. So they have still got young children, and our parents are living longer. So they are now at that point where they've still got young children to look after, and they're also looking after aging parents. So that sort of society has changed, and that's become something that is having an impact on people. Plus the fact that we're all got these really stressful jobs. We tend to also see being busy as, we see it as something to be proud of, I think, something that we should celebrate. I've been busy all day running around like a headless chicken, and that's all great. And actually, it's not really a good thing. We should celebrate downtime and relaxation. And, all of that stress is a real problem. And it's a huge trigger. I would say probably around 80%, maybe even, you could even probably push it to 90% of people that I see in clinic have stress as one of the root causes of their autoimmune disease. It may not be that it is the sole root cause in everybody, because that's very rare that we actually get one root cause. Usually we find that there's a few things going on in a person's body that is triggering that autoimmunity or driving the autoimmunity. But I would say in 80, maybe even 90% of cases, stress is one of those root causes. And it's not necessarily just like one stressful event. It can be little low-lying, ongoing chronic stressor. And that's the thing that's changed as well, I think, with our society, is that we have a lot more of those low-lying chronic stressors in this day and age. So I think, outside of the COVID thing, definitely stress and our fast-paced lifestyles, this modern living that we have, the fact we're having children later and parents are living longer. It's not that that's a stress, it's just it makes us busier as people. And we're not very good at having that downtime. We don't switch off the same. We're looking at our phones until right before we go to bed. We're in that sort of blue light that keeps us awake, right up until we're trying to get to sleep. That wasn't the case. People didn't have screens the way that we do. So definitely just the way society has gone and the way we've changed, it's having an impact. I think as well, our nutrition has changed, dramatically over the last, 30, 40, 50 years. It's hugely changed. We can go down to the supermarket and buy, essentially fast food, ultra processed food. We can go and get it from just down the road, and it's easy and people are busy, and, our nutrition and diet went that way very heavily, particularly in, it was called the SAD diet, the standard American diet, but it's very much in the Western countries. It's not just an American problem. And that's definitely had an impact. And the other thing I would say, the final thing is, I think, environmental toxins as well. Our food is all sprayed with chemicals these days. Again, that's something else I talk about in the book. We're consuming a lot more toxins, and all our food is wrapped in plastics. And some of these chemicals, some of these toxins actually pass through breast milk as well. So we're actually feeding it to our babies, and they're growing up their entire lives with this chemical load, this toxic load in their body. And toxic load is a huge autoimmune trigger. So I think I think those are the main reasons why I think we're seeing a lot more autoimmunity and why it is a growing epidemic. And we're at the stage where it is an epidemic now. But I think there's a mix of those sort of the COVID events and the things that were happening anyway. our lifestyle, stress, fast-paced lives, nutrition, environmental toxins, that's all stuff that was happening anyway, regardless of COVID. But then obviously there has been this sort of boost with COVID as a viral trigger and with the impaired sort of immune function that has come around that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but it's a very good question because it is a hugely growing problem, and it's one of the biggest health issues that we are facing as, globally, not just in the UK, but globally, it's one of the biggest health epidemics that we are currently dealing with. Okay, so next question comes from Sophie. Thoughts on porridge alternatives, please? Yeah, so I don't know quite whether you mean alternatives to different porridges. So if you want to do different porridge, not from oats, you can look at things like buckwheat and quinoa and things like that. If you're wanting different breakfast outside of porridge, I'm not quite sure which you mean here. There's lots of options for really healthy breakfast. I always say to people, it's great if you can get some veg actually in at breakfast. It's a really, really great thing. Ideally we want sort of 10 portions of veg a day in the diet. I know the NHS, sort of say 5. It's not enough. We should be aiming more for 10 or 10 fruit and veg. So, sort of 8 veg and 2 fruit. So if you can get some of those veg in at breakfast, that's going to hugely make a difference to your day. I like to try and get some of these things in early. You don't want to leave it all till dinner because then you find you've got to just pile loads of different things on your dinner plate. So if you can get some of those in at breakfast, then that's great. If you have an omelette, for example, you could throw some tomatoes in there, throw some spinach in there. So just get some of that veg in there. Having asparagus as well with your eggs, instead of having boiled eggs with bread, have boiled eggs with asparagus tips. So getting some veg in at breakfast, I think, can be a really good thing and can really help with that, hitting those targets throughout the day. So that can be really beneficial. If what you're asking is how, sort of alternatives on just sort of your plain porridge or using something different from oats, then you can absolutely use things like buckwheat or quinoa, particularly if you're wanting to, just mix things up a bit. And, oats, these things are sort of gluten-free. So they're good for everybody really in the morning. Porridge is great because it fills you up. But what I would say with it is, if you are just doing your oats, your milk, making, nut milk or dairy milk, just making your porridge and maybe throwing a bit of fruit on there, there's a lot you can do to kind of pimp that porridge out. So I would look at what else you can actually add. Throw some cinnamon in there. Cinnamon is really hugely, anti-inflammatory. So if you can make your porridge anti-inflammatory, that's going to really help as well. And you can do this regardless of whether you make it with oats or buckwheat or quinoa, whatever it might be. But throw some cinnamon in. I really like cinnamon in my porridge. It means you're just adding that anti-inflammatory bit. Throw some seeds in, pumpkin seeds, get some of those in there. You can top it with goji berries, getting some nuts in there, different fruits as well. We tend to stick to the same. So most people usually with porridge reach for something like blueberries. Don't get me wrong, blueberries are brilliant for you. And they have a lot of health benefits because they're one of those lovely dark purple foods. But do mix things up a bit, add different fruits and things as well. So really think about how you can pimp that porridge up. Try and get some healthy fats on there as well. So, with the nuts and the nut butter as well, that can be a really good way of getting some of the healthy fats in there. So it's really creating that sort of healthy, balanced plate with a bowl of porridge or buckwheat or quinoa porridge, whichever way you want to do it. But you can absolutely use any of those if you want to change from the oats. Yeah, and then maybe try switching up the porridge for something different as well that has some veggies in there. So I know some people listening to this might not eat eggs if you're vegan, but yeah, do a veggie breakfast. Do a cooked breakfast that's made with veggies. Do spinach, tomatoes, asparagus. Make a vegetarian kind of cooked breakfast. That can be really nice as well. Yeah, so that's my sort of thoughts on porridge. Always make sure with porridge that you're pimping it up as much as possible. If you want to switch oats out, then you definitely can switch for things like buckwheat and quinoa. And try alternatives to porridge altogether. And if you do, try and do that in a way where you get some of those vegetables in there. I hope that helps. Okay, so the next question comes from Sarah. So Sarah has Hashimoto's. I worked very hard in healing my gut after microbiome tests showed dysbiosis. I tackled several vitamin deficiencies I had developed and started to learn what my trigger foods might be. Cutting gluten made an immediate improvement for a period of time. Since my Hashimoto's thyroiditis diagnosis and intolerance testing, I'm gluten, dairy, egg, and yeast free. I know that I no longer have a flare-up or reaction to any of those foods. If I were to have them, not a reaction that I notice anyway. I assume this is due to better gut health. I see varying opinions on whether a one-off occasion or now and again to have these foods is okay or just not worth it despite feeling okay. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So the first thing is with any autoimmunity or thyroid condition, it is really common to have something called intestinal permeability. So this leaky gut that we hear talked about on social media a lot. And that is quite commonly a root cause. So intestinal permeability is when the cells of the intestine wall, they're called the tight junctions, they open up wider than we want them to do. And they should open to an extent because we want to allow nutrients through into our bloodstream. But if they open up wider, they allow things through into the bloodstream that we don't want through. So the larger molecules we don't want through. We want the smaller molecules, which are nutrients through, but not the larger ones. If the larger molecules get through and get into the bloodstream, then the only way to eliminate them is through your immune system. So your immune system then has to be activated and come along and mop them up. Now, with any autoimmunity, so for you with the Hashimoto's, but for any autoimmunity, the last thing that we want is your immune system constantly activated. So we don't want an overactive immune system in anyone because it can trigger autoimmunity. It also increases inflammation. And if you've already got autoimmunity, that's going to cause a problem because that's going to just keep causing these flares. And it can also take away from energy production. So we don't want that either in any, a lot of autoimmune patients, the fatigue is one of the defining symptoms. So that's the first thing. That's the sort of the gluten specifically in relation to autoimmunity. Then we're talking, because with you, we're talking about Hashimoto's. We're then looking at thyroid patients with gluten. And in thyroid patients, a gluten-free diet has actually been shown in studies to reduce TPO antibody levels and reduce the TG antibody levels, to increase vitamin D levels, improve your inflammatory markers, cause less immune reactivity, and has also allowed in the studies more people were able to reduce thyroid medication. In terms of that, you don't say whether you are monitoring your antibody levels or whether you've, how often you're having those checked. But in terms of that, removing gluten from the diet can be beneficial on those antibody markers, which can help people with Hashimoto's. So it can be beneficial to leave gluten out of the diet for that reason, as well as the general trigger of autoimmunity. Also, we find in the vast sort of majority of Hashimoto patients that they quite commonly in the studies have been found to have at least one of the HLA-DQ genes. So these are the genes that cause celiac, which is the autoimmune gluten problem. So if you're celiac, you cannot touch gluten. What these studies have found is that most people, the vast majority of people with Hashimoto's, have at least one of these genes, which will mean they may be celiac, they may not. At the very worst, they'll be celiac. At the very best, at the very least, they'll be gluten sensitive. So gluten does appear to be quite a significant problem in people with Hashimoto's. And that can be going on and causing that problem, building that, increasing that inflammation in the body, even if you were just sensitive to it and you're not noticing a significant impact in terms of symptoms. So for that reason, generally, gluten we try and keep out of the diet with people with Hashimoto's. So that's taking gluten separately from the foods that you sort of said you were sort of keeping out. Gluten is the one that I would probably say, if you're going to keep something out of the diet, gluten's the most likely one. So then generally, we then have to look at food sensitivities outside of the gluten for each individual. We basically want you eating as diverse a diet as possible. That's really important. It's the best thing for your gut health is to be eating as many different foods as you possibly can. I'm not an advocate for cutting food groups out for no reason. Like we've said, gluten, there is significant research to show that for Hashimoto patients, it's best removed from the diet. Outside of that, we want as much really in the diet as we can get. Now, there are other things that can cause issues. So things like lectins, which are found in, nuts, seeds, grains, they can cause what we have like a cross-reactivity in people, so especially those with autoimmunity. And one of the things that lectins can cross-react with is TPO, so these TPO antibodies in people with Hashimoto. So some people struggle with eating lectins. Some people don't. So this is where really we need to get sort of specific with each individual rather than saying as a group as a whole with Hashimoto's, these foods need to be cut out. Now, with the lectins, the other thing to think about as well is one component of gluten is called wheat germ agglutinin. And it's actually the lectin part of these foods, these gluten foods. And this is why some people will say that they were tested for gluten and they were okay. So I know you said it showed up for you, but for some people, gluten doesn't actually show up. And that may be because actually they have food tested for gluten, but they haven't food tested for this wheat germ agglutinin, which is a part of gluten. So we do have to be careful just relying on food sensitivity testing because it's not always quite as accurate as we would like it to be. The food testing that I run in clinic, I only work with autoantibody testing when it comes to food instead of your sort of standard food allergy testing. The standard food allergy testing is more restricted, more sort of limited in how you can use the results. So what I would say with all other foods outside of the gluten is you really want to be getting a picture of what works for you personally, how it's impacting you as an individual, as opposed to just being a case of you've got Hashimoto, so all of these foods need taking out. One of the best ways to do that is to run an elimination diet. I would recommend that you do that with a practitioner because it needs to be done in a very specific way. That's something that we do in the group program. If people need to run an elimination, we'll run that in the group program and really find out what your individual answers are to everything. So bar gluten, try and get as much back in the diet as you can, making sure that you're not reacting to it. Keep a food diary, make sure that you are logging, and remember that things, you don't always react to food at the time that you eat them. So, you really want to be monitoring your reaction to food sort of for 48 hours after having eaten them, because that reaction is not always immediate. So yeah, outside of gluten, try and get as much in the diet as you can, testing individually, either through elimination or ideally autoantibody food testing. And other than that, yeah, gluten is the one that I would say with Hashimoto's, I would keep out for everybody with Hashimoto's. Hope that helps answer the question. And yeah, hope it means you can get a bit more food back in the diet. Okay, so next question is from Caroline. So Caroline would like to ask whether with Hashimoto's, if you successfully manage your autoimmune condition through diet and lifestyle and reduce the thyroid antibody load, does your thyroid gland recover? If so, how do you manage your levels of thyroxine prescribed to treat the hypothyroidism? Okay, so the first part of this question is, does your thyroid gland recover if you bring down your thyroid antibodies? So sometimes people get a little bit confused with thinking that antibodies are actually doing the damage. So antibodies are not actually causing the damage to your thyroid gland. Your antibodies go out and mark tissue. So they're basically just putting a little flag in different tissues around the body. Your antibodies are not actually causing damage. They are flagging the tissue in the body. If your immune system is then activated, it will come out and it will mop up flagged tissue. So these that are marked from these antibodies. So the level of your antibodies doesn't directly correlate with severity of disease. And I think sometimes people think it does. So I get people a lot that are trying to compare their antibody results to other people. This happens a lot with, especially in thyroid patients. You can't compare your antibodies to other people. For the reason being that let's say we've got one person whose thyroid antibodies are 600 and we've got somebody else they are 60. If the person who has them at 600, their immune system is actually balanced, it is not activating all the time, they're going to have lots of tissue marked, but the immune system is not going to come out and mop it up. Now, the person who's only got a reading of 60 has got a lot less tissue marked, but if their immune system is activated all the time and they've got a lot of inflammation, then all of that tissue that's been marked is going to be damaged. So we can't compare antibody results from person to person because it's dependent on more things than just what are the antibody levels. What we can do with autoantibody levels, and this is why you should repeat test them in yourself, is we can look at the progression of your illness. So not to compare it to other people, but just looking at yours. So if, for example, you were 600 and then it comes down to 400 and it comes down to 200, we know that we're getting less of that flagging happening from the antibodies and we're likely to get less damage of tissue. So we're moving towards that remission. So that's how the antibodies work, which is, I think, a little bit different. I think people think antibodies are the thing that are causing the actual damage. They're not. So bringing down your antibody load is a good thing and shows that you are moving towards remission. It doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get any more damage to tissue if your immune system is still in overdrive and if you've still got a lot of inflammation in the body. So it's about more than just monitoring antibodies to know whether or not you're kind of moving towards remission. We need to look at the picture as a whole. So your question of if you reduce antibody load, does your thyroid gland recover? So the first part is it's about a lot more than just the antibody load. We need to look at that picture as a whole. We need to look at the antibody. We need to look at the inflammation. We need to look at the immune function. So there's a lot more that we need to look at to see whether you're moving towards that sort of remission. The other side of that, does your thyroid gland recover? So tissue that has been damaged won't recover. So once you've hit the point of being, at disease state where you've got a diagnosis, you've got damage to the thyroid gland, the tissue that is damaged there is damaged. What we need to do is protect any further damage. And that's what working on your diet and lifestyle will do. If you have like subclinical thyroid, so your function tests are coming back a little bit out, or you've got antibodies, but your function tests are normal, and you're not diagnosed yet with thyroid, there may not be any damage yet to the thyroid gland, in which case then it's about working to prevent it. If you've already got diagnosis and you've got some damage to that thyroid gland, then that's not going to recover. So what we're doing at that point is bringing all that load down and making sure that there's no further damage to the tissue, or we push back the damage to the tissue as much as possible so that we are protecting you for the future. We want less damage the further on we go, the better. So the thyroid gland doesn't recover. We work in a preventative way of not having any more damage than we need. And then the third part of your question was, if so, how do you manage your levels of levothyroxine prescribed to treat? So I do work with people where we can bring medication down. Some people can't. Some people really struggle to get medication levels down. But I do work with some people where we can get that level down. So I work with it depends which one my patients want to do it, either with their GP that they already working with, or with my GP that we work with through clinic. And we monitor levels. And when that is changing, when that medication level is changing, we repeat blood tests a lot more regularly. We make sure that we're keeping an eye on everything until we get to a point where it is balanced for the person. Whether or not we get people down is very individual. Some people do manage to bring medication down. Some people I've worked with have actually come off medication. Other people have not been able to get their medication down, but get their symptoms down and feel a lot better and are not causing any more damage to the thyroid. So it's very sort of individual and personalized, and we do it in a collaborative way with either with your GP or with the GP I work with in clinic, and we monitor, make sure that we're really monitoring closely when we're changing dosage. But sometimes we can tell, as we start working on the diet and the lifestyle things, sometimes people can actually almost move towards being, if they've been hypothyroid with the Hashimoto, they can actually almost move to being hyperthyroid and start getting some of those sort of symptoms. And at that point, we know, let's do another blood test. Let's see where we're at. And at that point, we maybe need to get the GP involved and have a change of dosage of medication. So yeah, some people do get to bring it down, which is great if we can do that. And it's always the goal if we can get there. But like I said, it's individual. It depends on the person. We always do it with a doctor on board, and we monitor closely to make sure that we're doing it the right way and keeping you balanced and preventing any of that damage in the future for you. So I hope that helps. Okay, so I'm going to do one more question in this episode. We've had loads of questions come in, so I think I'm going to probably do 2 or 3 of these episodes answering your questions. I'm going to do one more, and then we'll jump into some more in the next episode in a couple of weeks. So the next question is from Sarah, and this actually ties in a little bit with the one we've just done. So my antibodies have come right down. They could still come down a bit further. If antibodies do come right down, does this mean that someone's Hashimoto's would be in remission? Yeah, so really, like we've just said, what we're monitoring with your antibodies is kind of the activity of the disease. So what we're looking for is less of that tagging of tissue. And the lower that we get those down, the more towards, being in a sort of state of remission, the closer to that you are getting. Like I said, there is more involved than just antibodies. But antibodies are a good way of monitoring the sort of disease progression, which is what we're looking at if we're looking to see if somebody is worsening or moving towards remission. So they are a really good marker for doing that. That being said, we also need to look at the immune function, how your immune function is working. We've got markers that we look at for that. We've got markers that we look at for inflammation. It's a bigger picture, and we're looking at a broader range of things to make sure that, if all of those markers are coming down, then yes, then we can say somebody is moving towards remission and hopefully at that point would be feeling better. So yeah, antibodies is one part of that picture, but we would also be looking at things like your inflammatory markers and your immune function, so the markers for your immune function as well. So yeah, if you do want to kind of be monitoring that, I would say try and get a bit of a fuller picture than just antibodies, but antibodies are a really great place to start and a really good thing to be able to monitor in terms of looking at that progression of Hashimoto's. So I hope that that's really helpful. I hope it's answered some of your questions. I know, like I said, there's lots come in, so I am going to record some more of these and we'll do a few episodes on this, getting questions out for you. If you've got any questions that you want answered and you missed the opportunity to get them in, do drop me an email. We'll put the email below this episode, the email address, or you can get it off my website, or drop me a DM on Instagram. We're on there at good_health. The email address is info@nicolegoodhealth.com. Feel free to drop me any questions over. Yeah, and I think answering some of your questions is a good way of just making sure that the information we're getting out to you on the podcast is information that you want and that you need and that helps you move forward in your health journey. So I will see you next week. We've got another great guest coming on. So that will be out. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll answer some more of your questions. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Good Health Podcast. Do share the episode with anyone who you think it may benefit or who may enjoy it. And help me spread the word by rating the episode or leaving a review. If you want more, you can find other episodes in the series on your podcast app or sign up to my free newsletter. Not only will you get information on new episodes launching, but we cover lots of health topics with the Ask Nicole section where you can send in your questions, my favorite recipes, my favorite products, tips and tricks to help you on the road to good health, and much more. You can sign up free of charge at nicolegoodhealth.com/newsletter. Also linked below. I hope you have a lovely week. Don't forget to hit subscribe and I'll see you next time.